Sangham Saranam Gacchami Buddham Saranam Gacchami.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming and welcome to the Humanities Institute event series. Our theme this year is a broader history of thought, and we're exploring non-Western thought. Today, we'll explore the foundations of Buddhist philosophy. Just a reminder, here's the format for today's event. Our Humanities Institute fellows appear as panelists and may ask clarificatory questions along the way if those come up. Everyone else in the audience may type in questions in your Q&A function, and I can ask those on your behalf during the discussion, which is immediately after the lecture. Our speaker today is Dr. Miri Albahari. She is philosophy lecturer at the University of Western Australia and author of a fantastic book, Analytical Buddhism, the Two-Tiered Illusion of Self. She received her Ph.D. at the University of Calgary and teaches comparative philosophy. Dr. Albahari is building a novel, consciousness-based metaphysical system for what Aldous Huxley referred to as the Perennial Philosophy. Her ideas on this theme have been published in journals such as Philosophers Imprint and Journal of Consciousness Studies, and in the Routledge Handbook of Panpsychism. Please welcome Dr. Albahari on the foundations of Buddhist teaching and their philosophical implications.
Hello, everybody. Nice to virtually meet you all. So I'm going to, the title of this is slightly different from the advertised title, but it's the same content. So this is Buddhism and the Four Noble Truths, and the Four Noble Truths are the foundations of Buddhism, and they are the content of the very first talk he ever gave to his disciples after he became the Buddha. So what I want to do is I want to start by just a very abbreviated background on the Buddha, who he was, because without that, we don't really get the context of where he's coming from, where his teachings, what event precipitated it all. So the Buddha wasn't known as the Buddha, wasn't born the Buddha. He was known as Siddhartha Gautama, and he was born in Lumbini, near India-Nepal border, around almost like 2,600 years ago. So these photographs, the one on the right is actually from when 10 years ago I went on a pilgrimage there to the sites of the Buddha, and with some Buddhist monks at the local Buddhist society. It was a very a way to really make vivid the story of the Buddha, to actually go and visit the sites. As he was born into a wealthy family, and they had an intimation when he was an infant that he would either become a great wheel-turning monarch, a king who would rule the four corners of the earth with perfect justice, or he would become a Buddha. He would see old age, sickness, and death, which would precipitate his journey to find the key to ending suffering. And his father did not want him to become a Buddha. He wanted him to become a wheel-turning monarch. And so he brought him up in the lap of luxury, didn't allow him to see any old age, sickness, and death, had only the best cloth, the best food, the best perfumed lotus ponds. And he lived his life in that way, but always had an intimation that the happiness he had from the sensory pleasures wasn't it. He didn't quite feel that it was fulfilling in some way. And one day he encountered a sick person, an old person, and a dead person, and he was shocked and thought, is there any way that I can proceed in a way that makes my mind impervious to the suffering that life will inevitably throw at me? So he saw a wandering sadhu, which is common at that time, and also in current times it also happens. And the wandering sadhus are people who have renounced worldly life, and they set out in India to try to seek a higher happiness and escape from the ordinary vicissitudes of life. And they sometimes practice austerity. So the Buddha saw a wandering sadhu and decided he'd leave his palace and become himself, try to seek a higher happiness that is not dependent upon sense pleasures. And along the way, he learned various meditation and various austerities, and he actually practiced extreme starvation. So this is depicting the Buddha when he was completely, he became emaciated and almost died, very skeletal. And that other photograph is actually from on the pilgrimage, when that was the site where he practiced the starvation. And he realized, just as extreme sensory indulgence isn't the answer, nor is extreme deprivation and austerities, that doesn't work either. So he accepted some rice milk from somebody who offered it to him, and the ascetics who he had learned from, under which he'd starved, saw him and thought he'd gone soft and left in disgust. But undeterred, he sat down under what's known as the Bodhi tree and said, let me die, let my body perish, let my flesh dry up. I will not get up from this seat until I get full illumination. And he did that, and along the way he was tempted by visions of Mara, who's like the personification of temptation, who rides on his elephants and tries to take the Buddha off his course, but the Buddha is undeterred. And he has the liberating moment, where in a direct insight, which is not mere book knowledge, but a direct experiential insight, he directly discerns that life is suffering and the cause of suffering, and that there's a cure for suffering and the way to cure the suffering. So in a very, like I would say, a cognitively rich insight. It's not just merely a nice feeling of happiness he had, although it was a happiness which was completely free of suffering, but he also had this insight as to what the cause of suffering was, and that he wasn't what he thought he wasn't a separate self, and that there was nothing there to suffer, and his mind became completely liberated and completely happy, and he never mentally suffered again. So the Buddha literally means one who has woken up. And that idea of waking is very evocative. It's actually quite literal. It's like the idea is that before one's awoken, one is in a sense asleep to how things really are. And you wake up to how things really are, just as we wake up from a dream and we realize the dream isn't real. So the Buddha woke up and realized a lot of the assumptions we carry in our life that keep us suffering is also based in falsehood. It's not real. And so he then went to teach what's known as the Four Noble Truths. Noble because they actually liberate one from suffering. It's not merely an extra piece of factual knowledge. And that's what this lecture is going to go into. What was the content of the Buddha's insight? But before we do that, there's some pictures from Bodh Gaya, that's in North India, where the Buddha had his awakening experience. So that soundtrack you heard at the beginning, Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, it's like homage to the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha. The Dhamma is like the teachings, the Sangha is like the monastics who take up the Buddha's way of life, is what happened after the Buddha. And the that music is played at like 5 in the morning when I was on the pilgrimage, as one's circumambulating that building you can see there. It's very atmospheric, evocative, and you can see there some of the pilgrims. It attracts Buddhists from all over the world. They go to this site. And that on the left is a Bodhi tree, which is supposed to be a descendant of the one under which the Buddha sat when he had his enlightening experience. And then the Buddha was persuaded to teach, and he taught for about 45 years, and that's one of the places he resided when he taught Sravati. And then at age 80 in Kusinara, he became ill and passed away. And the Buddha, one of the content of the insight he had is that we have been born many times, like countless amount of times. Buddhism is a tradition that buys into like karma and rebirth. But when one becomes completely awakened, you're not reborn again. So many of his discourses were memorized by his closest disciple, Ananda. So Ananda had a photographic memory, so he could recall all of the discourses over the 45 years that the Buddha had had. And when he died, it was recited at a council of arahants. So arahant is the person who has fully awakened. So as a result of the Buddha's teachings, he taught, and many people in his precinct became also liberated. And the teachings were recited over various centuries. That's why they sound like in verse. It's got a mnemonic, and these are called the suttas. These are discourses, and eventually they're written down in the Pali language. And there is a photograph from depicting from on the pilgrimage the Buddha's final passing. So that's an extremely sort of fast history of the Buddha, just to give you some context. Now, there are many different kinds of Buddhism you will have heard of, like the Dalai Lama, who's at Tibetan Buddhism and so forth, but they all have in common these foundations. So there's a story of the Buddha that, based on the one I just recited. There's a textual and scriptural tradition. There's a framework of the Four Noble Truths, which we'll be talking about. There's monastic and lay ways of life. So people in the robes, so example, in my local Buddhist society, they shave their heads, the monastics, men and women, monks and nuns. They don't eat after midday. There's no entertainment. They're not allowed to handle money. They're not allowed to have jobs. They don't have relationships. There's no sexual activity. And so they basically give up a lot of sensory pleasures because they're all trying to attain this liberated state from suffering. And the lay people, that's how people who come along and they support the monastics. They give them the food, and the monastics in turn give teachings. Now, not all forms of Buddhism have that kind of strict way of life, but the Theravada, which is the earliest form of Buddhism, does. A cosmology they have based around karma and rebirth, so your actions reap fruit, which determines the circumstances that you're born into and things that happen to you. That's another common element. Teachings of no self and dependent arising, there's no such thing. So part of the illusion that keeps us asleep, as it were, and keeps us locked into suffering is that we are this separate thinker of thoughts, owner of experiences, doer of deeds. There is no such thing, but because we think there is, we seek to protect it all the time, to seek happiness and avoid suffering on its behalf, but there isn't actually a self. And so they teach, all forms of Buddhism teach some form of no self, and dependent arising, which is like the flip. Well, what is there? Well, the world, there isn't anything of substance or anything permanent. Everything is dependently arisen and causally dependent. And impermanent, radically impermanent, especially our experience. Things are changing all the time, even if subtly. They teach a progressive path of practice leading from good conduct and devotions through stages or meditation to a higher understanding. And we're going to hear a bit more about that when we talk about the Four Noble Truths. They think there are theoretical systems known as the Abhidhamma, Madhyamaka, or Yogacara. We're not going to go too much into that, except to note that they have theoretical systems associated with the different traditions. There's a path of a bodhisattva, which is someone who vows to become a Buddha, as the Buddha himself did in the longer story of his history. So that's a very roughly the common foundations. And Buddhism today, just to give you a brief overview, it used to be prevalent in India. It isn't anymore. So its living tradition divides into three broad areas. There's a Theravada or Southern Buddhism. That's the version we're looking at today. There's East Asian Buddhism, including Chan and Zen. So if you've ever been on a Zen retreat, that's Chinese scriptures preserved in. And there's a Tibetan or Northern Buddhism, which you would have heard of in connection with the Dalai Lama. That's followed in Nepal, Himalaya, Tibet. So that's just giving you a broad overview of context. And so we are focusing on the Theravada or Southern Buddhism. So that's a sort of a way of a background. So are there any questions at this stage? Okay, I will continue. So what I have now on the screen is the Four Noble Truths as they appear in the suttas. Remember the suttas that were memorized by Ananda and passed on. This is the content of the very first sermon that the Buddha ever gave. And he was persuaded to teach. He wasn't initially going to teach because it was so very complicated, but then he was persuaded to teach. He said, there are some with but a little dust in their eyes, and if you teach them, they can, they're not far off from liberation. And the first people the Buddha actually taught were the ascetics who had turned away in disgust when he was offered the rice milk and refused to starve to death. And so when they saw how radiant he was, they were much more amenable to hearing his teachings. And this is the very first talk he gave, which encapsulates the very foundations of Buddhism, out of which all the rest of Buddhist teachings expand from. Now, this, monks, is a noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain and despair are suffering, association with the unbeloved is suffering, separation from the loved is suffering, not getting what is wanted is suffering. In short, the five clinging aggregates are suffering. So just very briefly, the five clinging aggregates are our psychophysical constitution of our body and mind. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the origination of suffering, the craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there, i.e. craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, the remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of suffering. Precisely this noble eightfold path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So that's from the Samyutta Nikaya. It is one of the groups of suttas. So that I did quite a lot in there, which abbreviated can go something like this. The first now was dukkha, suffering, stress, unsatisfactory, unfulfillment exists. So dukkha is the Pali word for suffering, to be distinguished from the salad seasoning, which is AH. Every year my students talk about liberal sprinklings of dukkha. They mean suffering, but that's not the salad. Okay, so just bear that in mind. The origin of suffering is tanha. Now that's the Pali word for craving, thirst, desire, attachment, emotional investment in desire satisfaction. The cessation of dukkha lies in the cessation of tanha. The cessation of dukkha involves nibbana, the extinction of defilements that spring from tanha, the uncovering of the unconditioned mind. The fourth, it says that there's a path to the cessation of dukkha and hence to nibbana, the Noble Eightfold Path, which involves virtue, sila, meditation, samadhi, and insight, wisdom, panya. So that might be a little bit more comprehensible, but still, hopefully, if it's totally comprehensible, there's no need for me to give this lecture. So the whole, what I'm going to be doing in the rest is going into what this means in more detail. But just to give you like an overview of the logic behind it. So the idea is suffering exists. That's something we all know. I don't think I know anybody who's never realized the truth of this on some level. But there are more subtle nuances to it that we'll go into in the next slide. But it's basically there's suffering. Okay. The second noble truth says the origin of suffering is tanha. Now, I like the translation emotional investment in desire satisfaction. So that's when your happiness is dependent upon things being one way rather than another. So when things go the way you want it, you're happy. When things go the way you don't want it, you're in some way displeased. It causes some displeasure. So that is the source of suffering. Now, you might say the source of suffering is COVID. Okay, well, in some sense that's true, but there's a deeper origin of suffering, such that even if you were to fix the COVID, there would still be other ways in which you suffer, even if the pandemic, say, were to end. So the third noble truth is the cessation of dukkha lies in the cessation of tanha. So if you get rid of the craving for things to be one way rather than another, if you no longer emotionally invest in your desires being met in the way you want it, then that actually gets rid of all the suffering. Now, I should clarify something here. It's not going to, if you bang your toe on the furniture, it's not going to stop your toe from hurting. So that physical suffering, at least while you're in a physical body, it's not going to get rid of that. But what it is going to get rid of is all the mental suffering, all that goes, that other layer that goes on top of the physical suffering, and all the stress and anxiety and depression and disappointment and grief. All of that is going to go. Okay, so did you hear that little beep there? That was my. You didn't hear, okay. I'm hoping my work email is not impinging suffering into my Zoom talk, okay. And then the fourth says there's a path to the cessation of dukkha and hence to nibbana, known as the Noble Eightfold Path, which involves virtues, meditation and wisdom. So you heard right view, right understanding, right livelihood, right action. That is actually broadly condensed into three aspects, which is conduct, mental training, which is a meditation, and the insight that comes from that. So the insight is approximately what actually liberates you. So let me now talk about this in greater detail. But further, any questions on this general structure of the Four Noble Truths? Okay, so talk about the first noble truth, reality of suffering, the dukkha. As I said, it's a little more subtle than just the overt physical and mental pain, although that's included in it. So just banging one's toe on the furniture, physical pain, stomachache, all of that kind of thing, headache. But then there's suffering has a more subtle meaning, which is the suffering of change, which is anticipation of pleasurable experience ending. So I'll give you an example, like right now, where I live, there isn't really a pandemic going on in Perth. We're like in this little bubble, but there's this constant sort of feeling of this could end any minute. And in fact, we did have an outbreak from a hotel and we did have a brief lockdown. We were lucky on that occasion, but even so, it can be something, even when things are good, there's a stress, a slight feeling of it's going to end, it's not going to last. So it's a suffering that comes from change. And there's also the suffering, which is a development of this idea of condition. So the Buddha said everything is dukkha, everything is unsatisfactory. So if I'm eating vegan ice cream and I'm really enjoying it, how is that dukkha? Well, what it means really is that, I say I have the experience of the ice cream in this particular moment, is that none of it, it's not going to last. It's related to the fact that it changes. And it's not a worthy source of refuge. I can't put my happiness eggs in the basket of eating a vegan ice cream. Why? Well, the ice cream is going to finish, the experience is going to finish, or I might find something horrible in the ice cream. Nothing is permanent, nothing is certain. I might suddenly not like that flavor anymore. So you can get bored of pleasurable activities. So everything, because it's so ephemeral, it's not a place where you can plant your stake of happiness and say, here is where I'm going to invest, because it's changing. It's not a refuge. So that's what it means to say everything is dukkha. It's not a refuge from suffering. And through understanding this first noble truth in depth, the aspirant who's on the path becomes deeply disenchanted with the conditioned world as a source for real happiness. So by conditioned, we mean things that are dependent on other things. So my state of enjoying the ice cream is dependent on the ice cream. It's dependent on having a place to eat it. It's dependent on my physiology. It's dependent on lots of different things. And anything you're enjoying right now, I mean, this lecture is dependent on the Zoom working, such that it can easily change, and hopefully it won't. But you can't be sure that it's going to deliver a happiness, and it won't last. So that's the first noble truth. The second noble truth says the origin of suffering is tanha. So it's an unquenchable psychological thirst, and as I said, emotional investment in desire satisfaction. So craving and attachment. So desire by itself isn't an ideal translation. Does anyone have an idea of why it might not be just desire? I know that's how Grozowski talked about it, but why is desire not itself an ideal translation? Anyone want to say? Okay, if not, I'll just answer. That's because that's something to think about. Why doesn't it work? So imagine somebody like the Buddha has become liberated. They might still have physical desires. So that's why desire doesn't quite work, because you can have bodily desires, a desire to go to the loo, the desire to eat. The Buddha still had that. Those desires weren't eliminated. So it's not those desires that are the problem. It's being attached to whether those desires are fulfilled. So the difference between the Buddha and myself is if I'm, say, having a nice meal and somebody suddenly comes and pinches a piece of food off my plate as I'm sitting in the restaurant, just a random stranger comes in and decides to just help themselves, I'm going to get a bit upset. The Buddha would be cool with it. So the Buddha is not attached to finishing the meal, even though they might enjoy the meal. So the tanha is manifested in three main defilements. And so that sounds a bit like a moralistic term, but it's in this context, it's a descriptive term. So called defilements of the mind: greed, which is a pull towards; aversion, which is a push away; and delusion, which is a failure to apprehend that greed and aversion lead to suffering. So greed has normally bad connotations, but it's a technical term here. It simply means this urge to grasp at what's pleasant and to be attached to it. Aversion is just this urge to push away the unpleasant and to not want it, to be made unhappy if you have it. And delusion is a failure to apprehend that these mental, very, very deep mental habits lead to suffering. So the Buddha mentioned three objects of tanha. There's tanha for objects of sense desire, tanha for existence, and tanha for non-existence. So let's have a look at this schematically. I call this a table of tanha. So greed for sense objects. Now, let me just sort of mention that the Buddha didn't think that there were just the five senses, the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, tongue, and the touching. The Buddha also counted the mind as a sense organ, and sense objects for the Buddha would include thoughts and themselves desires of themselves sense objects and all mental goings on. Those count as sense objects for Buddhism. So it's important just to be aware of that. So greed for sense objects is wanting what's pleasant to continue. Aversion to sense objects is wanting what's unpleasant to end, such as a pain. And delusion with the sense objects is because you fail to realize that their nature is impermanent, without a self and conducive to suffering if clung to. That's why we keep doing it. Now I'm going to be saying more about what that means down the track, but this is just to give you an overview. Now, what's existence? What does that mean? Well, in this context, existence is one sense of oneself. So greed for existence is like wanting to see oneself as a particular kind of person and to continue as that particular kind of person. So it's such things as wanting recognition, not wanting to, just wanting to live forever. And if aversion to existence is things like self-hatred, you perceive yourself a particular way and you don't like the way that is. And again, the delusion is well, if you only believe that because you believe you are a self. And remember, I said earlier about no self, there isn't actually any such thing as a self. So that's why greed for existence and aversion for existence, meaning the kind of self one takes oneself to be, is based on a delusion because there isn't a self to begin with. Greed for non-existence is like when you actually you don't want to live anymore. That's an example of that. Or you wish the earth would open up and you disappear, with really embarrassment, things like that. And aversion for non-existence is like fear of not existing, like fear of dying, fear of the kind of person you are being rejected, that sort of thing. So now I've sort of given a schema. I'll talk about these now in a bit more detail. So this is the wanting the pleasant to continue. So greed for sensory objects, wanting the pleasant to continue. So that's again, whether through the five senses or mind, it leads to clinging and attachment. It leads to wanting to possess them. So we have pleasant sensations come up through the five senses, whether it's a taste of an ice cream or a lovely romance, and you want to possess it, and it leads to suffering, since the impermanent object either will not be gained, you'll be spurned, unrequited love, or it will be gained and lost. You find the person of your dreams and then they find someone else, or they die, or the pleasant mind state will not be sustained. You get bored of them. That's why people cheat. So there's no sense objects that impervious to this sort of thing happening. That's why it's always has a seed of suffering in it. Now, here's an interesting question. So people often think when they see this, well, I shouldn't enjoy this nice meal. You know, here I have paid for a lovely falafel. I mustn't enjoy it. That's greedy. That's not actually the case. So in fact, if one's not attached to the taste, one enjoys it even more because you're in the present. You're not worried about the future. So it's really the attachment to the nice sensations that's a culprit, not actually enjoying the nice sensations. And so that's an important distinction to be aware of. Otherwise, people think Buddhists are killjoys, don't enjoy things. Actually, the fact is, I've experienced this to some extent myself on a retreat, when you really take a practice for a few days and you're really in the moment. The food actually tastes better when you're not worrying about or thinking ahead to the next forkful, or even thinking about something else. You're actually really in the moment. So what actually is the problem is being attached to the nice taste of the food, such as if you're licking the ice cream and the ice cream blob drops on the concrete, then you're not made upset by it if you let go of attachment, that sort of thing. Now, there's aversion to sense objects, which is wanting the unpleasant to end. That leads to suffering, since the things of the world, being impermanent, will inevitably bring one into contact with them, such as through injury, illness, misadventure, or death of a loved one. So it is fairly easy to see how that causes suffering. And again, the problem isn't the unpleasant sensation itself, but the not wanting it. And now this is put these four in the category: greed for existence and non-existence, and aversion for existence or non-existence. So greed for existence is the urge to be a particular kind of person. So to be attractive, smart, good at sport, popular, accepted and respected, and to just keep the state of affairs going forever. And that leads to suffering because, of course, people get old, they get sick, they're not so attractive, they make mistakes, they might be really on top of the world, and then, like Tiger Woods, break his leg, you know, so you can't compete in the next golf tournament. So things happen. It leads to suffering when you emotionally invest in being this particular kind of person. And if one thinks one isn't the way one ought to be, then there can be aversion for one's existence. So things like body dysmorphia and gender dysmorphia and things, if you perceive that I'm, say, physically or mentally, this is what I am, and I don't like it, that can lead to things like self-loathing. So that's aversion for one's existence, which is another form of tanha. So this can then lead to a greed for non-existence, say, to annihilate oneself. So that can sadly happen too if someone, say, it really doesn't like oneself. So that's an example of that. An aversion to non-existence captures things such as a fear of death, or probably more commonly, the loss of one's currently enjoyed status as a particular kind of person sustaining. So the rejection is an emotion which really comes out of an aversion for non-existence, because you're attached to existing in a particular way. And the flip side of this is you're worried about not continuing to be perceived in that way. So you see people having all this cosmetic surgery to forever look young. They're not accepting maybe the way things are, that youth is impermanent, and they're getting upset and trying to stave the tide of old age. So the connection between these kinds of tanha and suffering is, I hope, fairly obvious. In fact, some of the greatest forms of suffering are tied to a sense of one's identity, whether one likes it or not, and the kind of anxiety to preserve it. So we might sort of then reflect on whether particular values promoted in society reinforce narrow expectations of the kind of person to be. They feed into this greed for existing in a particular kind of a way. And for an aversion, we, by comparison, might not feel that we look like these figures. So we might be like that person who spent a lot of plastic surgery to look like Jennifer Lopez. Just because it's again comes from, it causes suffering. And it's not even a moral judgment in Buddhism. And that's another important thing to get across. It's not saying one shouldn't do that and it's wrong, but it's just saying there's a causal connection between this kind of emotional investment and suffering. So how does the delusion side of tanha kick in? Well, greed and aversion and the suffering generated are symptomatic of a failure to understand things as they really are. Namely, that since things in the world are by nature impermanent, there would never be lasting satisfaction to be had through pursuing these things. So we somehow implicitly think, we mistakenly suppose that a permanent and fulfilling, utterly fulfilling satisfaction can be gotten through obtaining these impermanent things. And that's what, including myself, unless you're enlightened, that's what people do all the time. You're constantly trying to be a particular way, to get pleasant sensations, push away the unpleasant. And according to Buddhism, that's based on a deep delusion. So we think that we'll be made happy if we can just arrange the world the way we like it. And we're failing to understand that our experience is inherently impermanent. You can never pin things down and freeze them in that way. So long as we continue to cultivate tanha by looking for lasting satisfaction in what is unlasting, suffering will continue. So tanha and delusion creates the karma that binds a person to the cycle of birth and death. So remember, Buddhism has this wider cosmology of karma and rebirth. So karma is like the quality of one's actions. And so long as one dies with any tanha in their minds, they will be reborn. And that's what causes it, propels you into the next life. So tanha also goes with a sense of self, a solid, seeming, lasting personal entity on behalf of which we seek lasting satisfaction from things in the world. Actually, there's no such thing as the self. So that's part and parcel of the illusion. So the illusion is that we could get happiness from an impermanent world, but also there's a self on behalf of which we can get that happiness. There is no such self. So this leads us to the third noble truth, that the cessation of tanha will lead to the cessation of suffering. But before I go on, are there any questions at this juncture? Yes? Nikki?
I had a question about dependent arising or dependent origination.
Yes.
And just wanted to clarify what that looks like, especially in association with tanha.
With tanha. Okay, so I haven't talked too much about dependent arising, but the Buddha, they talked about 12 different links of dependent arising. And the important link is, I think, is the arising of pleasant sensations and unpleasant sensations and neutral sensations. And that conditions, and there's a mental mindset. How do you react to that? And that's a bit of the chain of dependent arising, where it seems up to you. You can cling, you can choose to cling to the pleasant sensations and to cultivate tanha for them, or you can just, it seems an option to not cling to them so much, to lessen the clinging. But that's the point of the chain of dependent arising at which tanha is really relevant. It's that arising of the pleasant. You can't do anything about the sensations that arise, but you can do something about whether you choose to cling to them or not. And that actually comes up, more is said about that in the fourth noble truth, the methodology. How do you actually, sever the link there? Yeah. Okay. So the third noble truth is the cessation of tanha will lead to the cessation of suffering. So understanding with maximal clarity that things are impermanent, without self, and subject to suffering if clung to, entails a release from the bondage of existence and suffering, which in other words is nibbana. So nibbana literally means blowing out or extinguishing, and thus in this context it's suggestive of an event. And that's what happened to the Buddha underneath the Bodhi tree. So what is extinguished? The fires of greed, aversion, and delusion, like the defilements of the mind, defilements because they keep one locked into suffering. So we might, again, to go back to an earlier point, think, well, I might get rid of my suffering by just changing the way the world is. That's only going to be a short-term effect. So if I have an itch, I can scratch it, but another itch is just going to come up. It's not going to get rid of the underlying cause. So the Buddha isn't denying that you can temporarily get rid of dukkha by trying to change the world and one's mental, physical configuration, but this isn't going to systemically uproot the problem of the chronic mental suffering that we all have. So a person who has attained nibbana is called an arahant. Nibbana can be designated as the event of losing tanha and mental dukkha. So it can be that moment in which you have that deep insight and you can never go back to thinking that the world is that way again with a sense of self and with dukkha. but it could also be characterized more positively as a state or mode or nature of the arahant's mind when they've been liberated, as unconditioned. What does that mean? What does it mean to say the mind is unconditioned? Well, at the very least, it means it's not dependent on anything. It's the disposition to not be swayed by tanha or mental dukkha. So, in other words, you're totally cool with everything. That sort of sounds a bit glib, doesn't it? Totally cool with everything, but absolutely nothing can make you angry, can make you upset, can make you grieve. All of those emotions, which have some component of emotional investment and desire satisfaction built into it, which have tanha built into it, those emotions are not possible anymore. So nothing that happens to you can actually affect the mind. And here is a sutta on the arahant, which I find is quite instructive to read out. Loss and gain, disrepute and fame, praise and blame, pleasure and pain, these things are transient in human life, inconstant and bound to change. The mindful, wise one discerns them well, observant of their alterations. Pleasant things do not stir his mind, and those unpleasant do not annoy him. All likes and dislikes are dispelled by him, eliminated and abolished. Aware now of the stainless, griefless state, he fully knows, having gone beyond. So one can see that the kind of disposition one has, nothing stirs the mind. The mind remains equanimous for the arahant. And this is not based on burying the head in the sand, but through knowledge. One fully knows having gone beyond. And that's really essential to Buddhism, is that it comes from an insight that the claim is into the way things really are. It's not from just saying, I can't stand this anymore. No, you can't hear. It's not like that. Okay, so the character of the arahant, are they just left like a neutral blank slate? Are they just completely like a zombie? Well, no. The character of the arahant is motivated by generosity, compassion, and wisdom. Every trace of greed, delusion, and aversion is eliminated from their minds in a dispositional as well as an occurrent sense. So what do I mean by that? Well, at that point in time, if you pick any point in time, there won't be any greed, delusion, or aversion in their minds. There won't be any tanha, and their minds are such that is disposed to be in such a way that it will never happen. So it's not just saying now it's not the case. It will never be the case. Nothing can disturb the mind. There's no sense of a self. That is completely gone. A separate me or who emotionally invests in things being one way rather than another. There's no mental suffering. An arahant is not reborn into the cycle of birth and death. And then an interesting question is what happens to the arahant after death? And that's one of the questions that the Buddha famously refused to answer. One thing the Buddha agrees on is that parinibbana, now that is a kind of term, so nibbana is what happens, is the event of liberation from suffering. Parinibbana is when the arahant dies. So that entails the end to all suffering, physical as well as mental. So when you're not reborn to a physical body, there can be no more physical suffering either. So while the arahant's alive, they can physically suffer. Someone tried to poison. No, I think the Buddha had a terrible stomachache. That wasn't from a poisoning. Somebody offered him something. He knew it was off, but he ate it so as out of compassion for the person who'd offer it. And he had a terrible stomachache. So he can still feel a physical pain, but when he died, he's not going to be reborn, so even physical suffering will end. So it really, truly is an end to all suffering, according to the Third Noble Truth. So some questions that one might want to think about in connection with this is, what would the arahant's character be like? Would they be passive and speak in a quiet voice? These are certainly the questions you can think about for the Q&A. Is it possible to act efficiently in the world without emotionally investing in the satisfaction of desire? So can you act when you don't care about the outcome at all? And can you act efficiently? And following on from that, what would have to be true of human nature if nirvana were possible? So one thing I didn't quite mention is it's the highest happiness. It's not a neutral state where suffering is burnt out. It's actually happiness is is only an approximate word that we usually contrast with suffering, but it's in the league of happiness, but with no possibility of ever suffering. So it absolutely is a blissful state. So what would have to be true of human nature if Nibbana were possible? And is Nibbana something worth seeking? Is it in fact the most valuable mode of being in which a human can attain? And the whole premise of Buddhism is that it is. You can't get anything better than Nibbana, but then you're not reborn anymore. And you don't have the normal kind of human motivations. Is that something that people would want? So these are kind of questions that come up within the vicinity of what we've looked at so far. Are there any other like clarificatory questions at this point? Okay, so let's get to the fourth noble truth. So the Buddha isn't a pessimist. He's not just saying there's suffering and there's a cause and a cure. He's actually saying, okay, and then here's a practical way in which you can actually get liberated. That's a path to the cessation of dukkha. So the fourth noble truth describes the way to attain Nibbana via what is called the Noble Eightfold Path. This is broadly divided into three categories, which is wisdom, right view, right intention, virtue, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and meditation, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So I'm going to now talk about this in more detail. But one thing to note is that it's not the case that you first practice wisdom, then virtue, then meditation. They're deeply integrative. Each of them support the other. So the more you increase one, that helps increase the others. So that's a kind of path that it is. It's not linear, in other words, in that sense, although one does start from where one is and end up liberated according to Buddhism. So what do we mean by wisdom? So most generally, wisdom characterizes the outlook which informs one's entire way of thinking, emoting, and acting. So a suicide bomber might sincerely intend to make the world a better place, but the viewpoint from which his well-meaning intentions arise is deluded. So it's an outlook which is completely free of delusion, and free of tanha. That's what wisdom is. It involves harboring intentions when one practices as a path that are increasingly wholesome, being non-attached, compassionate, with compassion and goodwill. Wisdom isn't merely book knowledge. It's a progression towards a deep-seated cognitive, affective, that's like emotional, and ethical transformation, which results in progressively understanding the Four Noble Truths, including the nature of conditioned existence. So that's just the nature of everything that falls within the ambit of our sensory experience, including the mind. So we understand its nature as deeply impermanent. And it's not merely factual knowledge. Factual knowledge isn't necessarily transformative. I mean, it can be, but it isn't in this case. So I can say I know that everything's impermanent. I know I did a Ph.D. and wrote a book on no self, but I don't think I was an iota more enlightened by the time I finished it. I had just as much tanha, just as much, even bigger ego than ever, you know. So it doesn't, so knowing something intellectually doesn't actually isn't, it's not that it doesn't help, but there's a lot more to it than that. And so one has to actually do the hard work and actually change the structure of one's mind. So virtue is right speech, right action, right livelihood. So virtue and meditation can be viewed as a dual methods that serve to increase meditation by purifying the mind. So virtue pertains specifically to improving speech and behavior, the outward manifestations of inner intentions. So Theravada Buddhism holds that if a behavior systematically causes harm to oneself and others, such as in extreme cases, murder or less extreme dishonest speech, it reinforces the grip of tanha and delusion, making it impossible to advance in one's practice. So if, just to give quite a coarse example, if one goes and steals all the time, that stealing is coming from a mindset which is you wanting something for yourself that's not earned, and in a complete disregard for other people, lack of compassion, that's not going to help you on the path. And it's also going to come up in your meditation as something that disturbs the mind. And so it's not going to help the other parts of the Noble Eightfold Path. So other behaviors such as helping others are claimed to have a beneficial effect on the mind, and so are promoted. So Buddhism has certain modes of behavior, not taking life, at least not causing harm, I should say, to other people, including oneself. You include yourself in it too. Even if the self doesn't exist, you have to have the working assumption that it does when you're on the path. So you don't harm others, you don't steal from them, you don't cheat, you don't have harsh, dishonest speech, you don't cheat on your partner, and you don't take intoxicants in a way that makes you irresponsible. And there's or you don't take them at all when it leads to the mind being clouded and gets in the way of the practice. So those are sort of precepts that are associated with Buddhism. Meditation. So while virtue purifies the mind from the outside in, meditation purifies the mind from the inside out. So meditation in Theravada Buddhism can be broadly divided into what's known as samatha and vipassana. And so that's concentration and insight, both of which aim to increase the general mindfulness. So concentration techniques such as focusing one pointedly on the breath make the mind become less prone to getting compulsively lost in distracting thoughts and more attuned to what's arising in the present moment. So I like this analogy of going to the gym. So if you've never worked out before and you're not particularly muscly and you try to lift heavy weights, you just can't do it. So how do you come to lift really heavy weights? Well, you go, you practice, and you lift them progressively, more and more heavy weights, and eventually you can build up the muscle and lift much more than you did before. But analogously, what meditation does, that's concentration, is you take one object like the breath and you focus the mind on the breath, and then when thoughts come up, you say, you note there's a thought, and bring the intention back to the breath. And it's remarkably difficult. I imagine a lot of people will have tried meditation. It's not easy, even 10 seconds, and then the mind is lost in some thoughts. That's like the weakling at the gym. And the idea, why is it that you want to become present though? That's not just the end in itself. So by becoming present and with what's happening in the moment, then the mind is able to notice the arising of unwholesome thoughts and wholesome thoughts, and cultivate what's wholesome and inhibit what's unwholesome. So nip in the bud a really harmful chain of thought. And then that helps enable the insight, because you can now start to see that thinking in this way causes suffering. Whereas before you're lost in the thought, then you suffer. You don't really know that it's happening. The meditation, it creates that space for you to, like a lab, to observe what's happening in your mind in the moment, and then to be able to work on the mind to transform it. So concentration strengthens the mind for the vipassana, the practice of understanding and influencing one's mental states as they unfold. Okay, so that's, and then the more that you do that, then the stronger the mind gets, and then one, eventually, it's sort of, I like this analogy actually of a hot stove. So why is it that one keeps, even though you might know intellectually that tanha leads to suffering, what meditation does is it puts the mind into, helps to train the mind such that the insight, the wisdom part can actually take effect. So when you actually clearly see that certain thought patterns are causing suffering, the mind of its own accord, because it doesn't want to suffer, lets go. You don't have to actually have a will for effort to let go. You create the conditions that the mind, it sees this train of thought, say of like an angry train of thought leads to suffering, and it naturally doesn't want to go there. Just as, like, say if you put your hand on a hot stove, you don't need to reason, oh, this is hurting my hand, I better take it off, it's causing damage. You take it off automatically. So the idea is the same thing happens mentally. The meditation makes the mind such that you notice these destructive thought patterns, and of its own accord, the mind will let go. But you can't notice it while you're lost in thought. So that's what the meditation does. And that's how the process works. Okay, I think I've gone on enough. I have some questions that arise in connection with that. But like, why don't we just go to the Q&A now?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Albahari. Everyone's on mute, but I'm sure everybody's clapping. I'm going to open it up for, I have some questions in the Q&A. I just wanted to open it up for a couple of panelist questions first, and then we'll switch over to the Q&A.
Yep.
Chigozie, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about the sort of virtue part in the fourth noble truth. And I was wondering sort of like, there was this point of not doing harm, but I was thinking what would be recommended sort of beyond that and like avoiding the harm that is being done by others. Like, for example, what would be recommended about like, I don't know, joining in a fight against some injustice. And if it's recommended, I was wondering how that sort of like is compatible with the idea of not really being attached to the outcome of a certain thing, because I feel like that would be kind of hard to have both, if that makes sense, and to be efficient in that.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's sort of on the border of something which probably would be better for a monastic to answer that question. But I think when I've heard monastics talk about this question being asked, I'll relay the kind of things they would say is like joining a movement is not, it can be a positive thing to do, but it's when one becomes very invested emotionally in both one's sense of identity as being a member of that Greed for Existence. I am an activist, and it can become egotistical, but also perhaps more destructively, it can, when one becomes really upset, it can actually have a detrimental effect on the mind. And so if that's happening, it's probably not such a good idea to join an activist movement if on the whole it's going to cause a negative state of the mind. So the kind of guideline that the Buddhist monks have heard when they talk about it is always, is this actually creating more peace, peaceful frames of mind, happier states of mind, or is it actually making me agitated? If you can do like activism without getting agitated, then all the good, if it's a good cause. But if it's kind of lead to a painful agitation, then it's probably best to reconsider. So that's what I've heard, the sort of things that monastics have said about that.
Thank you.
Any other panelists for now want to ask? Hannah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, first of all, for your speech. It was very thorough and also humorous.
Yeah, good.
I watched an interview that you did a few years ago with Robert Wright, in which you discussed the question of panpsychism a bit, and I found that really interesting. Could you elaborate at all on any interrelation there is between your work and panpsychism, or anything interesting you've encountered?
Okay, so controversially, as you might have picked up in that Robert Wright, my interpretation of Buddhism, of the Nibbana, the content of the insight, so is not merely that there isn't a self, but that I take it to be everything grounded in consciousness. And now that was, the Buddha just said he taught a handful of leaves, which is like he knew the whole forest, but he only taught a small subsection of what he had, the insight he had had. And there are other traditions like Advaita Vedanta, which go into more the metaphysical aspects of, well, what is the nature of the world? Rather, the Buddhism is saying, well, you're not a self, everything's impermanent, and understand that, and the rest will take care of itself. Well, in my work, I'm making it my business to do the rest, in like the metaphysics, like if there's no self, what is it? What is it that grounds reality? What is it that grounds the world? So Advaita Vedanta has this idea of everything, the consciousness that I have doesn't actually really belong to me. And by consciousness, I mean the awareness, that a field in which things come and go, which always seems to be present, that actually turns out to be the ground of all being. Everything somehow comes out of consciousness. So that's, in my work, that's how it relates to panpsychism.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to move to just take a couple of audience questions, and we can always come back to the panelists if there's more time. One of the very first questions we got early on during the lecture is kind of a general question for you. Is there any epistemology of Buddhism? And,
Yeah.
No, go ahead. I was gonna guess. I was gonna guess what this participant was hoping for, but I think your guess would be better than mine.
Okay. Well, actually, the last slide, I can share the screen to show the show that where I was going in the end. Let's see. So it says what kind of knowledge is involved in wisdom, which internalizes propositions already intellectually known? How does it differ from intellectual or book knowledge? So I'm interested, I mean, is there an epistemology of Buddhism? I would say yes, there is. And I've done a little bit of work on that myself, in that I'm very interested in what is transformative knowledge? How do we understand that epistemologically? So I've written a paper called, gosh, I now can't remember the name of my own paper. I think Insight Knowledge in Buddhism, an epistemic analysis, or something like that. It appeared in Philosophers Imprint, I think in 2014. And I try to analyze what is it that, say, someone like the Buddha and Arahant, when say, someone's like, I'll give this sort of scenario, someone's giving a talk on no self and they know all the philosophy, they know all the facts, all the neurology about no self, everything. It's like Mary in the black and white room, if anyone's aware of that scenario in the philosophy of mind, where somebody knows all about color, they've perfectly know, but they've never seen it for themselves, what's lacking in their knowledge. So this is an analogous, somebody knows all about no self, but they're giving a speech on no self and they're terribly nervous. It's very evident to everyone. So they have a very strong sense of self. So is there anything lacking in their knowledge of no self if you have a strong sense of the self yourself? So that's one example of an epistemic, very interesting puzzle that arises in Buddhism. I'm not sure if that was where the person was going with the question, but that's a puzzle that I've worked on, and I had a proposed solution to how it might work.
Thank you. Yeah, and let me read you another question from the audience. I'm not sure if we'll get to all of them, but we'll try. Thanks for the excellent talk. For fear of committing the genetic fallacy, I wonder if you think Siddhartha's probably mythic backstory might have some bearing on his sentiments towards craving and suffering. Specifically, he came from a life of total privilege. Is there any worry that this might distort his views on craving? Perhaps for the average person, there's more appeal to pursuing the fleeting joys of, say, vegan ice cream, the nice house, and so on. In other words, were Siddhartha's general observations about craving to flow from a less privileged mind, might they be less averse to craving and certain kinds of suffering?
That's a good question. I would say, in a way, Siddhartha was in a better privileged position to see the shortfalls of craving than the average person. So, but that doesn't mean that what he saw was not viable. So, so he was in a position to be sated, to realize he had actually both extremes. He had also the austerities he practiced as well, when he almost starved himself. So he had both extremes, he experienced both extremes. And I would say that placed him, having gone to both extremes, and he would have experienced something a bit in between in the 6 years in which he was seeking enlightenment. But it's like he's now experienced had the whole spectrum of experience, and having exhausted it, he realizes it's not a refuge for happiness. So I think epistemically, he's better placed to see the shortfalls of suffering than somebody who's maybe is allured. It comes from a poor background and is very allured by the glitter and bright lights of the city. That person is more likely to be deluded with and think that it's better than what it is. So I think, yes, in one sense, the Buddha was in a privileged position, but an epistemically privileged position rather than an epistemically unprivileged position. So in a good way, he was in it. It's like you've exhausted all the field, you've looked around, you've seen it doesn't work, and now you're in a position you're ready to try something else because you've become fatigued, you've become disenchanted with it. But until you've really exhausted some of that craving, and that's even what the path of Buddhism actually, heard some monks say this. Sometimes if you have a really strong desire, it's not particularly harmful to yourself or any other, live it out, get it out of your system. Otherwise, it'll keep irking you. So that's so. And then once you've got it out of your system, then you can move on. So I don't think it was a problem for the Buddha's insight. I think it actually put him in actually a better position.
Thank you. Yeah. So do we have any other hands up in the among the panelists, or should we go to another audience question? Just want to give you guys a chance to jump in. No, okay. Well, we have kind of an open-ended question, but you can take it. You can take it however you will, I suppose. This is just an invitation to talk more about what it means that there is not a self. I assume that this is something on everyone's mind. Is that we're not exactly sure what that means.
What that means, yes. Unfortunately, I had to skip over it in this context. But the self is, first of all, it's elusive. Try and find the self. Try and find yourself. It's look inside. And David Hume very famously had this passage where he says, when I search inside, try to find the self, all I can find is a lot of fleeting thoughts and experiences. There is no self to be found. So the self is that thing on behalf of which we seek happiness. We seek to satisfy our craving. So let's say I want to go and see a movie and I'm invested in it. On behalf of who do I want to go and see a movie? Well, myself. It's not on behalf of my husband I want to go and see a movie, it's myself. And the self is implicitly that thing which seems to be in the boss of the body, seems to be that thing that generates the thoughts. So when you say have a thought which you maybe think is pretty clever and you feel proud of it, that there's a feeling of pride, but that seems to point back to this me that's having that feeling of pride. And then conversely, when you do something embarrassing, there's a feeling of, oh no, I wish that hadn't happened. And that feeling seems to then point back to a me which has had that feeling. And the self seems to persist over time, so that you do something embarrassing at a party the night before, you wake up in the morning, you remember it and you go, oh no. And that feeling of, oh no, is an identification with that entity that you perceived did the embarrassing thing. So you feel that there's a persistence. You feel it's persisting over time. It's initiating your actions. It's that thing on behalf of which you feel happy or proud or embarrassed. And it's that thing which seems to have a boundary. So I take myself to be that thing that owns my body somehow, and somehow is also identified in some way with my body in some context. And so the sense of self can when you think, oh, I've got scraggy hair today, my clothes aren't good, that my is a feeling of personal ownership that you have towards the entity that you take to be the body and to be owning the body. So the self is, according to Buddhism, that thing, it's also the most important thing in the world. That's really a central aspect of it. It's that we think, even though we might love somebody else, which we do love somebody else, but we have a huge emotional investment in their well-being, and that emotional investment is felt on behalf of ourselves, who we care about this entity more than any other entity. So there's what I call the asymmetrical self-concern. And so there's this wonderful passage, I think, in Far From the Madding Crowd, when Farmer Boldwood is trying to impress Bathsheba, the maiden who he wants to marry, and he's holding a party, and he's ironing his coat, and it says, some very humorous passage that said, the creases in his coat were more important than an earthquake in Bolivia. So you can have something happen which doesn't affect all these people dying as much as something that's relevant to yourself. So, and it's not even a moral thing. It's just that's what we do. So it's this sort of sphere of importance that it's imbued with. It's a unique thing. There's only one of you. There can't be any others. So in my book, I do go through sort of different attributes of the self, because we can't introspect and find it. We sort of have to say, well, what kind of modes of behavior and emotion betray our allegiance to this entity, the self? And what Buddhism says is there really isn't any such thing as the self. So this thing on behalf of which we are seeking happiness and avoiding suffering, once you find it doesn't exist, so I've heard it described as the most immense relief. So if you say you're dreaming about, say, being attacked by a tiger or something like that, and you wake up and you feel relief that that wasn't happening. It was only a dream, and it fades away. Similarly, they say that's what they say, we're in a way asleep. We haven't woken up to the fact we're not a self. And it's analogous, just like to literally waking up and then you realize the inside, this thing which I've been suffering on behalf of doesn't exist, and it's incredibly blissfully, it's a relief, that they say. So I don't know if you want me to say more about the no self, but I mean, interestingly, the difference between a religion or a tradition like Buddhism and philosophers in the West. So you get philosophers in the West like Hume and Dennett and Owen Flanagan, who also say there's no self, but what they say is that you need to buy into the sense of the self in order to stay alive. It's a necessary part of something our brain does, like a little program running in it, which helps you to automatically take care of the body. Otherwise, it would die very quickly if it didn't have built into it this program of automatic self-concern. It's a way to keep the body alive. So Antonio Damasio, the neurologist, has a great book, The Feeling of What Happens, which sort of gives an evolutionary a neurological story to what the sense of the self is. And Buddhism wouldn't necessarily deny that up to a point, but they say, well, you can't skip having a sense of the self. You have to have a healthy, robust sense of the self before you can overcome it. But then they say it's actually there's a potential to actually function much better if you get rid of the sense of the self. And it's actually possible to do that. So that's the difference between Buddhism and say, Western traditions.
I'd like to follow up on behalf of the person who asked this question, but this is coming from me, and it's actually coming in a way from our seminar where we read various things leading up to this talk. I think one of the things that puzzled me and perhaps some of the students is the relation. So sometimes you read things in the literature to the effect that Buddhists don't really say that the self doesn't exist. They say the self is empty, or that it's not an independently existing thing, and this, I take it, has something to do with dependent origination and that. So I think part of the difficulty grasping this idea is just that we're not sure exactly how to understand the doesn't exist part of the self doesn't exist. So I wonder if you could help us with that. Maybe this is going back to our first question from Nikki about dependent origination.
So it's true that there's nowhere you can find in the suttas which the Buddha categorically says the self doesn't exist. So in my work, I've extrapolated it from it's implied in various aspects. So when you talk about dependent origination, and you say, well, what there is a things that are empty of a self, and the Madhyamaka traditions, which is the Zen Tibetan, they extend the idea of no self to all the objects. Nothing has a permanent essence. Everything is fleeting and interdependent. So they're not contradictory. They're complementary insights. So you say, well, what isn't there are solid, unchanging objects, or objects that they're deemed to have more permanence than they actually have. So this thing I call myself, but also objects like even laptops and tables are very much, there's something about our mind that reifies it and makes it more static than what it actually is, and makes it seem more solid. So the dependent origination and the emptiness of idea is a way at getting at, well, what is there then? If here is what there isn't, but what actually is there? And one way of reading what reality is in Buddhism is to say there's a lot of different aggregates that are arising and passing away. We might parse them in different ways, like into physical form, into feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, into perceptions, into mental formations, thoughts, and into consciousness as it's directed towards these objects. And these aggregates, which make up what we are and make up what the world is, and the sphere of our experience, are changing. They're codependent on each other. So something arises like a mind state that's codependent upon how the mind was a moment ago, mental formations a moment ago. So they arise, they condition the new moment, and then they pass away. And so another way to understand the insight into no self, a corollary, is to understand everything is empty of permanent essence and just thoroughly codependent on one another. There's a lot of fleeting codependent aggregates that arise and pass away. And somehow our mind is tricked into making everything static and solid. And again, maybe an evolutionary advantage to try to retain object permanence and self-permanence. But it's a program that actually ultimately must be undone if we are to actually overcome the suffering. So yes, that emptiness, that codependence, is just the flip side of no self. You say, well, what isn't there? And why is it important to say, well, there isn't this thinker of thoughts? Well, because we buy into the illusion that there is one. So it's good to be aware, they say, of the illusion that we're buying into, and then of how to undo the illusion by having a positive perception of what there actually is. And so the two work together. They're not in contradiction with each other.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one more question, unless one of the panelists wants to go. Nope. Okay, this one's just for a recommendation for further reading, which is a nice, always nice to get. The question is, do you have any book recommendations for those curious in implementing some of these truths? I think that was during the Four Noble Truths discussion, into their lives. Yeah, so there are lots and lots of what they call Dharma books by, if people are interested in the people from monastics who actually live this. I can actually provide. It's probably better for me to come up with maybe some selection, and there are also some good websites you can listen. I like listening to talks as well as reading books, but there are some good websites where one can listen to Dharma talks by monks that make the ideas very accessible. And they're on these themes of just living one's life in the framework of the Four Noble Truths. But there's a very good book on meditation by Ajahn Brahm called The Basic Method of Meditation. It gives a really step-by-step how to meditate. So Ajahn Brahm of Amso, he's the abbot of my local monastery, but he's also got a world famous status for his as a meditation teacher. He's extremely accomplished. But this book is very accessible to beginners beginning meditation, so I could suggest that one. There are some nice books on the Four Noble Truths, which I recommend to my students, which I can send you the links of that later. Yeah. So may this person should just email you and get you. And let me just make it clear that if anyone wants to email me about any questions, I'm very happy to answer. Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's very generous. Thank you very much. We're pretty much out of time. I want to thank everybody, even the people we can't see. Thank you for attending. Thank you to the panelists, and of course, thank you to Dr. Albahari for a fantastic talk. Yeah. And we hope to someday be able to host you in person. Well, I've really enjoyed this, and thanks. It's really lovely to see the panel. It's lovely to see people to talk to. So thank you for being receptive and for inviting me. And as I say, any questions, let me know. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.